We are very, very honoured to welcome again Ilan Pappé, who's going to speak on this very important meeting on does anti-Zionism is not the same as anti-Semitism. Ilan Pappé is an Israeli historian and author of, among many works, this one, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. He'll speak for about 35 minutes, and in this meeting, because it's a big room, we're going to use a speaker slip system, which means if you want to ask a question or make a contribution, there are team members in the red t-shirts walking around with slips of paper. Just indicate you want one of them, fill it in, and they'll bring it to the front, and we'll get as many people in as possible. So I'm not going to speak anymore because we want to listen to Ilan Pappé. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Hi, sorry I'm late. I took the district line, which was a mistake. Next time, central line. Okay. It's very uneasy, uncomfortable, actually, to talk about this topic because we are forced to explain that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism because the Israeli lobby and its supporters in this country would like us to challenge their distorted assumption that you can really equate anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. It's a ridiculous equation, but it became an outrageous one because it has been used, as you all know, first of all, to stifle the debate on Palestine, not only in this country, but also in the continent, and in the United States. And more precisely, it was used in order to depose and bring down politicians who might be promoted to positions of power and are known for the long-term support for the Palestine question, whether it's in the US or here in the UK. So as much as we are disturbed by an equation that does not really deserve our attention on the one hand, we cannot ignore it because it's in the public discourse, the mainstream media keeps using it, the European Parliament is using it, so we will have to challenge it, whether we like it or not. The second problem we have when challenging such a false equation is that you cannot do it by a soundbite. It's quite useless, actually, to go to a television studio and when people ask you, do you think that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and they give you 65 seconds to explain, you decide, and I think it's much better to decide, not to go. Or, and this is my advice to the very naive Labour politicians who bother to go to the BBC and Sky News studios, if you are already make the mistake and you go to discuss whether there is institutional anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, why don't you use the very short time they give you on air to tell them something about Palestine? Because they won't do this. Sky News has never reported anything that happened in Gaza in the last year. The BBC has stopped doing it in the last 5 months. Nobody reported that yesterday 50 young people were shot by the Israelis on the Gaza border, and the week before 49, and the week before that people were killed, medics, journalists, and young men and women. If you would listen to the mainstream media in this country, you wouldn't know about it. But if you listen to them or you read them, you would know that in Facebook 16 years ago, someone said something that might sound as anti-Semitism. Because you cannot do it in a soundbite, the only way you can do it is by historicizing it. What do I mean by that? You need to give an historical context to explain what is the difference between Judaism and Zionism, and hence what is the difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And it's very important to remember that anti-Semitism, or rather the hatred of Jews, because as you know, Palestinians are also Semites, as the rest of the Arab world, so it's quite a funny term, anti-Semites. So let's say anti-Jewish attitudes and policies have been with us for a very, very long time. And they are deeply rooted in the Christian faith, and they were used as justification for horrific policies of persecution, discrimination, and even genocide. We know that. And this kind of attitude is based on defaming or hating Jews because they are Jews. Whereas, that's a nice music for what I'm going to say now. I like it. It goes well with the next lyrics. Anti-Zionism, like Zionism, is a very modern phenomenon, unlike anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish feeling. It's a very new phenomenon, and it dates back to the days when Zionism appeared. I mean, that makes sense, right? And Zionism is a new phenomenon. And I don't know how many of you know, but Zionism started as a Christian project, not as a Jewish project. In the beginning of the 19th century, people who called themselves Zionists were Christian evangelical priests and thinkers who believed that the return of the Jews to Palestine would bring back Jesus Christ, lead to the resurrection of the dead, and the conversion of Jews to Christianity, or the shish kebabbing in hell if they won't do that. Now I call them the barbecuing Christians. Now these barbecuing Christians were very important in the beginning of the 19th century, but they're also very important today. They are the main base for President Trump and his supporters, and they're probably far more important Zionists. These anti-Semitic Christians are far more important Zionists in the US than the American Jews, who more and more feel uncomfortable, unlike the Anglo-Jewish community, unfortunately, in representing Zionism in Israel. And if you were an anti-Zionist in the beginning of the 19th century, it meant that you were not an anti-Semite. It meant that you did not believe that the Jews should return to Palestine. Namely, you were against getting rid of the Jews in your vicinity, even if the prize was getting the only Jew you wanted, Jesus Christ. So this is an important kind of reminder of how it started. Then we move to Palestine. When the Jewish, or even before we moved to Palestine, when Jews began to adopt the idea of Zionism in the late 19th century, because of persecution, because of policies of discrimination, because they felt Europe doesn't want them, and were looking for a safer place, and some of them even wanted to redefine Judaism as a nationality. When they suggested equating Judaism with Zionism, most of their opponents were other Jews, not Christians. Most of the Jews in the world in the late 19th century did not think that you can substitute Judaism with romantic nationalism. So you had ultra-Orthodox Jews who rejected the idea because they thought you were tampering with the will of God, and you're substituting a very rich religion with a very poor ideology of romantic nationalism. Or there were secular Jews who believed that communism, socialism, or even liberalism were universal ideologies that would help to bring down anti-Semitism and any other kind of racism that will make the world a better place, not just for Jews, but also for non-Jews. But Zionism had its way with the help of the British Empire and succeeded in building a base in Palestine, as you know, in the late 19th century. So Zionism becomes what we call today a settler colonial movement, where settlers come from Europe without any chance of going back to Europe that doesn't want them, and encounters an indigenous population, as they did in the United States or in North America, in Australia, in New Zealand, South Africa. And they encounter this indigenous population, and they think about themselves as being the indigenous, and they frame the indigenous as settlers, as foreigners. Zionism in this sense is not very different from other settler colonial movements that colonized the world. So if you were a local Palestinian and you rejected the idea that someone can come up, even with a nice story that they used to live there 2,000 years ago, if you rejected it, you were not an anti-Semite, you were an anti-colonialist person. And Palestinian nationalism grew out as an anti-colonialist movement from 1882 up to 1948, when the settler colonial movement of Zionism succeeded in ethnically cleansing half of the Palestinian population and destroying half of the Palestinian villages and demolishing most of the Palestinian towns and turned 750,000 up to 1 million Palestinians into refugees. Now, rejecting such a crime against humanity is anti-Semitism? Rejecting a crime committed by Jews makes you an anti-Semite? The people who rejected this crime rejected any other crime done by anyone else on the same magnitude, whether they were Buddhist, Muslims, Christians, or agnostics. It didn't matter. What mattered is what people did, not what their identity was. And it's very interesting how the Palestinians could not penetrate the international game by explaining that actually they have a just cause of decolonization and they are not part of the history of Europe's hatred of Judaism. But they had a tough time doing it. There was a moment when the world was a bit opened up to ideas of decolonizations in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And that's when the United Nations, in 1975, passed a very reasonable resolution equating Zionism with racial discrimination and racism. And under American pressure, this resolution was revoked in 1991. But at the moment it was adopted by a decolonized world that equated the struggle against Zionism with any other struggle against colonialism in the world. And that's why that resolution was adopted, not because of anti-Semitism. It was also an attempt to have a correction or rectification for a resolution that the United Nations took against the Palestinians in 1947, when they said that Palestine, the homeland of the Palestinians, has to be partitioned between a nation state for the settlers, most of whom have arrived in Palestine 2-3 years earlier, and the native indigenous population of Palestine. The United Nations that adopted the partition plan in 1947 didn't have one decolonized member state in it. The United Nations that adopted the resolution equating Zionism with racism was full of new nation state representing the decolonized world of the Third World. And that's very important to remember it. Now, we are now in the phase where Israel is inventing, or invented already, the idea of a new anti-Semitism. Now, the new anti-Semitism claim has nothing to do with all the history I told you, but that's a history you should know and you should tell people about, because I think it's important to explain how Judaism and Zionism have nothing in common in a sense, because one is a religion and the other one is an ideology. But what is important is to understand in which phase we are now. This is a phase that began in about 20 years ago. In fact, its origins are already in the first Intifada, in the first uprising in the occupied Palestinian territories in 1987. Official Israel understood that as the years go by, it's very difficult to stop conscientious people around the world with a modicum of decency in them not to feel repugnant by the Israeli policies towards the Palestinians. It was not like yesteryears where you could hide because people could not visit, people didn't know. After 1987, people knew. And what they knew motivated them to work on Palestine's behalf, to condemn Israelis' immoral policies on the ground. And the only way you could challenge it as official Israel was to kill the messengers, because there was no way of challenging the message. And how do you kill the messenger? You blame them of being anti-Semites, or if they are Jews, self-hating Jews. That's something else Israel invented, the self-hating Jew, which is kind of a disease that I have. And I consulted my doctor, but he said to me, forget it, it's chronic. Yeah. And they used the horrible events in 9/11 in the United States and the so-called war on terror to create this kind of an imaginary alliance between Palestinian liberation movement, the Palestinian liberation movement, fanatic and extreme Islamic groups, and right-wing supremacists to say they're all in the same boat, and what they have in common is hatred of Israel, which actually means anti-Semitism. It didn't work so well with the right-wing supremacists, because these guys, as you know from the EDL, adorn themselves with the Israeli flag. They're very happy about Israel. Also, the neo-Nazis in Germany and in Austria are very keen about Israel as a model. So they stopped using the alliance of the right wing and the left wing, and now they're just focusing on the left and the Islamist as being the alliance that forms the basis for new anti-Semitism. God knows why, and even he or she might not know why, it works with the political elites in the West and the mainstream media. I don't know if they are intimidated, if they are just insensitive, God knows what. But there is something there which boggles the mind, how easily they bought into this idea that criticizing the ideology of Israel is different from criticizing the ideology of apartheid South Africa. That if you criticize the ideology of Israel and not just one policy or the other, or if you are an academic like myself, and I'm definitely not alone, who says, from my academic scholarship, I can see the connection between the ideology and the policies we all agree are wrong. You can say I'm wrong. You can challenge me. You can try and debate me. But you try to stifle me by telling me that these are racist positions? I'm trying to show the connection between racist Israeli policies on the ground and the ideology of the State of Israel. That makes me the racist? That, if you are right, the person who says it, then every Palestinian in the world is anti-Semite. You can't be a Zionist Palestinian. I mean, there are 2 or 3, but you can't basically be. You can't be, in fact, a member of a Muslim community around the world who cares about Palestine and be a Zionist. So all the Muslims are anti-Semites. And what about the people on the left who for years rejected Zionism and supported the Palestinian cause? Are they also en masse anti-Semites? It's so illogical and superficial and stupid that you ask yourself, how is it possible that you hear philosophers, politicians, senior politicians, leading journalists explaining seriously when they also defend the idea that if you want to define what Holocaust denial means today, it includes criticizing the ideology of the State of Israel. So now it's a Holocaust denial. It's not anymore just being an anti-Semite. For some reason, you deny the Holocaust if you think that ideology that discriminates the Palestinians because they are the Palestinians, then you are such a criminal. It's insane. And this insanity, as you know, has entered the whole story around the Labour Party. You know, you even ask a journalist who just started her way in life to look at the timing of the first news of peace that announced that there is institutional anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. I haven't seen one journalist doing it. It's amazing. I did it. Not one journalist had bothered to ask himself or herself, what was the exact timing when suddenly we revealed that the Labour Party has institutional anti-Semitism? Do you know when it happened? I checked it. Not when Jeremy Corbyn was elected as a leader. No, after the 2 attempts to depose him had failed. Then the first piece of news arrived. Sky News. I love them. Sky News, the Fox News of Britain, Oh my God, it's just, I feel disgusted just talking about them. Sky News sensationally opened their news bulletin. We found evidence for institutional anti-Semitism in the Labour Party a day or two after the second attempt to depose Jeremy Corbyn had failed. Then you ask yourself, can you put yourself in your shoes of the Labour leaders who have to face these allegations? Now, I'm not going to use this platform to criticize too much the party I love and the people I like and I know personally. But I think there was something wrong in the way this whole affair has been approached. As if people here forgot the fact that in the 1930s, this party and people who believed in socialism were the only one fighting fascism in London. Whereas Theresa May's party included a lot of people who were quite mesmerized by Nazism and fascism. People should go back to history and see who was against racism and who had no trouble endorsing it. So if you have such a pedigree, if you have such a history, you should not cave in too easily and not be intimidated so easily. And the attempt to say, you know, you misunderstood me, or, you know, the photograph that shows me with the PLO leaders, I'm not really in, I'm on the left, I'm not on the right. This is a mistake. Be proud. I was in this graveyard. I was in this graveyard. As an Israeli Jew, I was there with Yasser Arafat on the graveyard of Abu Jihad and Abu Iyad, and I paid the respects for the freedom fighters of Palestine. Don't be ashamed. Don't be ashamed of being there. We need to change the conversation in this country. Palestinians are not terrorists. The Palestinian National Movement is not a movement of terrorism. It's an anti-colonialist movement that has not stopped fighting. And with everyone who's there, whether they are religious or secular, the reason, what motivates them are the wish to return as refugees to their homeland, to stop living under military occupation, not to live under siege in Gaza, not to be second-rate citizens as Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel. There's nothing wrong in supporting this cause. And if people want to call anyone who supports this cause anti-Semites, let them do this. Let them tell us that what we are doing is wrong and use the venues they give us to educate them on Palestine, not to answer their silly accusations. Now, I know it's easier said than done. I'm not saying it's easy. But I must tell you, someone who's been for a while an anti-Zionist and used to live in Israel, I was invited usually to the Israeli television to be court-martialed. Every now and then they needed some show for the masses. So they used to bring me, they didn't ask me any question, they just wanted to tell me you're a self-hating Jew, you support the PLO and so on. But even the 5 minutes I had, I educated the whole nation about the Nakba, about the crimes of the Israeli army, about the crimes of the Israeli Secret Service. Of course, they would stop me after 3 minutes and throw me out of the studio. But these 3 minutes would have been much better than explaining, no, I'm not a traitor, I'm not an anti-Semite, I don't hate myself, I actually love myself, or things like that. And I think that there's something in the way the Labour Party has behaved. I understand these campaigns of intimidation. I was a victim of it. It's destabilizing. They're using every tactic in the book to make you feel that you are under constant attack. But we should be better than that. We should really retake this conversation. If even someone who says, rightly says, the Labour Party deals too much with the conversations of anti-Semitism is suspended from the party, this is unacceptable in a party that believes in socialism, in social justice, in human justice. We are facing right-wing elites in the economy, in the culture, in politics. And we will have to fight them very strongly, because you can see how this type of a leader spreads from the US to the UK, from the UK to other parts of the continent. You will not be able to challenge these people by apologizing, by trying to satisfy them. You can't satisfy these beasts. You can only tell the world that you have a value system that is sound, that is moral, and relies on historical foundations of which we all should be proud of. And there are so many Jews in this country, and there are so many Jews around the world who feel as I do. So this is not even a Jewish or non-Jewish issue. This is really the issue of a place that has been erased from the public awareness and the media, but it's still at the heart of the civil society. And this civil society expects us, if we are activists beyond civil society, if we're activists in parties, in parliaments, in proper politics, expects us to represent their undeniable support and their full understanding of what solidarity with the Palestinians means in a clear, sound voice and without any apology or any attempt to satisfy the people who throw at us false allegations such as the one that we were talking about tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ilan. That was fabulous. So I'm now going to start calling, but there is a roving mic, isn't there, going to people, or people coming to the front? They're coming to there. Yeah. So unless you have access issues, which a roving mic will come to you, please come up to the plinth. For the first speaker, I'll call people two at a time, so the second person get ready. The first person is Phil Butland. If he could come down to the front, that would be great. Come and speak at the front. And the second person is Ryan Tipton. You'll have about 3 minutes to speak, and after a couple of minutes, I'll tap this and then ask you to stop. So if Phil Butland is here, come round up to the front.
A couple of months ago, the German Bundestag passed a resolution which said that BDS is anti-Semitic. This was a resolution brought by all four centre parties, so the Union, the FDP, but also the SPD and the Greens. The AFD didn't support the resolution because they had their own, which was significantly worse. The Linke didn't support, they had their own, which wasn't much better. And we have virtual consensus from Parliament which says that so BDS is anti-Semitic, speaking or acting for the rights of Palestinians is anti-Semitic. Now, the resolution is not legally binding. It has no direct effect, but context is everything. It is coming where in the last year there's been an increasing number of meetings on Palestine which have for various reasons not happened. There was in Berlin a Palestinian architect who is due to talk about architecture in Berlin. The room was unbooked by a university because she had supported the BDS motion, because she had brought a motion in charge of BDS. We have a speaker, Rasme Omert. He was one of the supporters of the Women's March in the USA. She had her visa revoked because she had made a confession extracted under torture 50 years ago in an Israeli jail. What the result of the resolution in the Bundestag is that this is happening more and more. Already, in the last couple of weeks, a Palestinian speaker has been banned from attending any meetings on anything remote to the Middle East. We had the American rapper Talib Kweli, who was banned by a concert hall which organises a lot of concerts with African bands because he had signed on to BDS. And I think we're going to get more and more and more. The effect of the resolution isn't direct state bans, but people censoring themselves. Okay, this is the time when I'm supposed to think, hey, things are great and we're going to stop it. I'm not so sure. The Jewish Voice for Peace in Germany has organised 2 big meetings of 150 and 100 people, but they were largely elderly, older, and people are not really oriented in doing things. Where I think we may see something, firstly, the international BDS campaign is important to us, but also last year we had a number of bands who were banned from concerts and festivals. I think this is going to happen this summer as well. And I think whereas the old German left is a bit caught in old discussions about German responsibility and things like that, young people who see that they're not allowed to see their favourite bands anymore because they've been branded anti-Semitic is the potential cause for a vote. Watch this space in the festivals which are happening in Germany, and please support the initiatives which we're taking.
Thank you. After Sophia, we'll have Tom Khai, please.
Hi. I am a proud anti-Zionist Jewish student, and I think a lot of us will be aware that the campuses for a number of years have been the battleground for the fight on free speech on Palestine. And, we have been fighting this on the left alongside, Islamic societies and PALSOC societies. And we have made some gains. We've seen BDS being taken up on the campuses. We've also worked really hard to get Anti-Apartheid Week, something that we celebrate every year on the campuses. However, with the recent attacks, we've seen these gains begun to be rolled back. And, we can see how support for Palestine in the UK, and especially on the campuses, has really shook the Israeli state. And it's no surprise that there's been evidence found that, the government has pumped money into UK unis to fund courses to fund Israeli history courses. And there was also Al Jazeera released a documentary recently where they kind of showed that NUS officials had been invited to meet the Israeli ambassadors, and they were talking and liaising with one another to kind of essentially discuss how they can shut down talk about Palestine on the campuses. And these people are really trying to rewrite history over the issue. And the attacks have created a climate of fear which has made it almost impossible to mobilise on the campuses. PALSOC have continuously had their meetings shut down. In my university, Bristol, we had to campaign extremely hard to get our very weak version of BDS, I must say, reinstated this year, although we did by a very small margin, and it was a very heated debate, but we did, so that was good. Thank you. But, these attacks have spread to not just explicit Palestinian societies. With the rise of Islamophobia, ISOC and Islamic societies have continuously had their meetings shut down. At my uni, they had a meeting on Islamophobia and free speech, and it was shut down on alleged cases of anti-Semitism, even though it had nothing to do with Palestine whatsoever. And we've also seen these attacks to left-wing socialist groups. And I think it is an absolute joke that the far right have taken up the issue of free speech against alleged snowflakes and have used it, as an excuse, essentially, to ramp up hatred against Muslims, when we all know that the real attack on free speech is over the issue of Palestine. And, this is what it's about, and we can't forget that. I think it was really brilliant to have Chris Williamson here last night. It's a disgrace that pro-Palestinians and socialists have been labelled as racists for their support for Palestine. But Chris Williamson showed us, what do you do when there's a witch hunt? You don't run away, you stand your ground, and you fight against it. And that's what we really have to do. And just lastly, I know I'm running out of time, I'll try to speed it up, but anti-Semitism is a real issue. My granddad was a Holocaust survivor. He was a Polish Jew held in the Warsaw Ghetto and liberated from Theresienstadt. And him and his brothers and sisters who were liberated by the Red Army, they know the consequences of real, true anti-Semitism. And it is the real threat comes from those on the right who are the same people who advocate themselves as these like free speech fundamentalists, along with nasty men like Salvini and Viktor Orban, who, by the way, Netanyahu has met this guy. He says that he's mates with him. And I just think it's really important that every time anti-Semitism is mentioned, we should be thinking of the Holocaust and the victims of it, not the people who have spent their lives fighting as anti-fascists. It's absolutely disgusting that these people are trying to co-opt and manipulate and change the meaning of the word itself. And just to finish, I want to be positive. Despite all of this, we've got a level of unity unity and clarity over the issue now on campus. We understand that our strength is our voice, and it gets louder when we unite, and that's what we've been doing. And we just got to remember that these attacks should not drown out the cries of the Palestinians. They're a distraction from the daily attacks that happen in Gaza. So thanks, Ilan, and, you know, free Palestine.
Yes, of course.
Is that better? On Monday, an Orthodox Jewish man wearing the attire that you would expect of an Orthodox Jewish man was chased through Whitechapel, just down the road, by a man wielding a knife. And as he chased him, he shouted, "You fucking Jew, I'm going to chop your head off." Why is that important? Well, it's important because the backdrop to this debate, much like Sophia alluded to, is that all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism, are on the rise. And, you know, I'm very proud to say that on Monday night, Tower Hamlet's Stand Up to Racism has called a solidarity vigil at Altab Ali Park, solidarity with the man who was attacked and a fight against racism. And I would ask that anybody who's still in London on Monday joins us. But you see, if you look at Jeremy Hunt's comments suggesting that his visit to Auschwitz reminded him only of the anti-Semitism of Jeremy Corbyn, you would think that anti-Semitism was a product of the left. And I find it so offensive and so angering, the idea that because I am against the state of Israel, somehow I'm an anti-Semite. When Nazi youth attacked me when I was at school, they did not stop to ask me what my position on Palestine was. All they knew was that I was a Jew, and as a result I was a target. And we cannot allow Jewish people to be divided by these racist lies. But nonetheless, who drives racism? People like Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, and so on. And what's interesting about those people is that Hungary is signed up to the IHRA definition. As Sophia said, Orban and Trump are some of the biggest Zionists in the world today. They have met with Netanyahu. So whilst it's absolutely true that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, it's also true that Zionists and anti-Semites often sit in the same bed. And the anti-Semitism debate in Britain has seen the reintroduction of anti-Semitic tropes that we haven't seen in British politics for a long time. The return of the good Jew and the bad Jew. The return of the idea that all capitalists are somehow Jews. Reintroduced by right-wing Labour MPs, by the way. And, you know, the point I want to end on really is about why I'm an anti-Zionist and why I'm a socialist. Because you see, part of the tragedy of Zionism is not just what's happening in Palestine, but that Zionism, as a response to racism, of course, driven by the reality of the Holocaust and the reality of anti-Semitism, is a way of challenging oppression which reduces Jews to having no agency. The only way that we can fight against racism is to be protected by American guns and so on. And I believe in a different vision of emancipation from racism, a socialist vision which is about the unity of all oppressed groups coming together and struggling against our oppressors. And that means that as a Jew, I have to stand alongside the Palestinian people. If it wasn't for the Great March of Return that started over a year, 18 months ago, I don't think we would have seen some of the mass demonstrations that have developed around the world. It's important to stand with Palestinian people because that vision of how we can challenge racism is right at the heart of it. Thank you.
I want to talk about the other major villain in this story, which is the British ruling class. It's very important to remember that Zionism was created by the Brits. The First World War Cabinet, which included Churchill, Balfour and Lloyd George, spent quite a lot of time debating Zionism, and they came to the conclusion it was a very good idea. It was a very good idea because it re-diverted Jewish migrants away from Britain into Palestine. It was a very good idea because a Jewish colony in the British Empire might serve very nicely for the British Empire. That's precisely, of course, what happened. It's important to keep this in mind because, as Ilan pointed out, the weaponisation of anti-Semitism aimed against Corbyn is coming from a number of sources. But this is a very powerful source, this British ruling class source. This is not in any way to deny the role of the Israeli embassy and Zionism generally, but the British ruling class as an agency is absolutely key, and it also flows from this. The Labour Party, one of the factors that people often overlook is the deep Zionist roots of the Labour Party itself. When Israel was formed, the Labour Party, of course, was the Labour government. They were partly responsible for, as indeed the British ruling class earlier, the Tories were responsible during the First World War for getting the Zionist project off the ground. The British Labour government immediately after the war was partly responsible for Israel coming into being. The Labour Party here, left and right, was Zionist. It's important to remember that the left wing of the Labour Party was Zionist. The one single communist MP that many of the Labour left-wingers relied upon, Phil Paratin, was a Zionist, so it's got deep roots. And I think this is important to understand something else. One of the things that's puzzled me is that why it was, when this thing blew, and it blew roughly about 3 years ago after the remarks from Ken Livingstone, why it was at that point Jeremy Corbyn's advisers didn't put around him, and there are people that would have done this, not necessarily at all from the far left. There's a significant number of left liberal-minded Jewish scholars who reject the notion that Zionism, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism are to be equated, and some of them were ready to go onto the media and to defend Jeremy Corbyn. But that never happened, and you have to ask yourself why. Why didn't that happen? They were willing to do it, but some of the advisers around Jeremy Corbyn said no. Why? Because, in my opinion, they were told, if you do this, you will split the Labour Party. Now, as a matter of fact, if that's by no means obvious, but I'm assuming that was the case, but when you think about what's happening now, that would have been probably better than this drip-by-drip attack on Jeremy Corbyn. And let me end on this note. That let's suppose they're successful. And this is the real irony and the real danger. Let's suppose it's successful. The weaponization of anti-Semitism is successful and Corbyn falls. What's going to be said by many people, otherwise in no way traditionally anti-Semitic, what's going to be said? Aha, it was the Jews that got Corbyn. Who's let off the hook? The British ruling class.
Due to the history of persecution of the Jewish people, it's difficult to talk about Palestine. But the reality is supporting Palestine and opposing Zionism is not anti-Semitic. Many of my friends are Jewish and support the Palestinians and understand the barbarity of the Palestinian situation. I've also visited Auschwitz and I've seen the horrors, and I've seen what real anti-Semitism is. When I went to Palestine at 15 years old, I met amazing people who were so positive. I saw the horrific oppression in places like Hebron. They said the most important thing we can do is spread their stories, and I promised to do that, and that is why I'm here today. The Western media are completely biased in favour of Israel. It is extremely personal to me and important, as 2 children I had met in Ida refugee camp in Palestine were killed a week later. So spread the message of solidarity and free Palestine.
Thanks. I've spoken many times on Zionism, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism and so on. But one of the most difficult meetings I had last year was when I was invited to Vienna to debate Is the Left Anti-Semitic at a big conference called An End to Anti-Semitism. And there were a couple of things about the conference. The first, one of the most uplifting things, was that the conference was a big conference. It had received a lot of media attention, and Kurz, the Chancellor of Austria, spoke at the conference. When he got up to speak, a group of Jewish students at the back of the conference unfurled a banner which said, "Kurz, conference on anti-Semitism, ? Why are you in alliance with the racist and Nazi Freedom Party?" Kurz, the response of the chair of the conference, now you'll find this hard to believe, the professor of liberal studies at the University of Vienna, was to call in security and to throw out a group of Jewish students who had not heckled Kurtz but had unfurled a banner, and they were huckled out of the conference. I'm proud to say that although I didn't speak German, I knew what was going on, and about a third of the conference walked out with them. And that was very, 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 very positive, very, very positive thing to happen. At my own session, the debate on is the left anti-Semitic, it was just incredible. Ilan Pappé described some of the things that are thrown at Jewish people who oppose Zionism. For the first time, they moved away from the idea of the self-hating Jew towards a description that was called from the platform an anti-Semitic Jew for the first time. It was a very difficult meeting. They rejected every idea of what you would call international discussion. The settlements, they claimed, were not illegal because the United Nations is itself an illegal organisation. And therefore, the best thing that I suppose that happened was the support there was from the floor, from the position that it is possible to be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic. In particular, as Ilan also alluded to, a large number of the American Jews who were at the conference stood up and said they agreed that it was absolutely feasible to be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic. So I think there is a lot of support for the idea that Ilan was putting forward, but we're going to have to redouble our efforts inside Britain to make sure that we're not labelled as anti-Semitic. Thank you.
Greetings, comrades, and Shabbat Shalom. I bring greetings from the United States in solidarity. Unfortunately, the UK isn't the only country going through this. There's a lot of anti-Semitism accusations on the left in the United States as well. Recently, our left-wing representative, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, correctly called the concentration camps that we have set up to imprison migrants and undocumented people in the United States concentration camps. And for weeks now, the media has been attacking her on, well, is it right to call them concentration camps? Is that offensive? And similarly here, you have the far right accusing the left of being anti-Semitic. The other day, Stephen King, who is a U.S. representative, who is an avowed and self-described white supremacist, had the audacity to tweet that he went to Auschwitz and saw the horrors, and how dare AOC call it a concentration camp. This is a man who literally is a white nationalist, who literally has campaigned in support of people who don't believe the Holocaust happened. And for some reason, this is allowed as the discourse that goes on. And I'm so sick as a Jewish person of being told that, I'm a self-hating Jew. I like your line about it being a chronic disease. I am although I don't know for sure, and this speech might make it more likely, in all likelihood, it's banned from the State of Israel. There are a list of 17 organizations that the state released a couple years ago, of whose members are banned, whose employees are banned, and I used to work for one of them. Now, I don't know if it applies retroactively or not, but in all likelihood, I'm not allowed to enter the state. And so why, if we're not allowing Jews who criticize Israel to enter the United States, if we are deporting Ethiopian Jews who live in Israel, how can we then say that, this is about defending Jews and defending the right of a Jewish homeland? It's not about defending Jews. It's about racism. It's about colonization. It's about apartheid. And Jews are standing up in the United States and not tolerating it. Some amazing leftist Jewish organizations that I'm part of, and I'm so happy to say that these past few days, when the anti-Zionist Jews are not just fighting for the Palestinians, they're fighting for everyone. The past few days, there have been protests all across the United States with anti-Zionist Jewish organizations associated with, if not now, shutting down ICE detention centers and occupying the streets and having mass arrests. So as an anti-Zionist Jewish leftist, I say solidarity and free Palestine.
I didn't know that Jay Blackwood, who put in the question, was here, and I'm very glad he is. I know Jay. I want to try and address that question. It would be foolish to understate and underestimate the scale and depth of the assault around the new anti-Semitism narrative and the impact that it has had on suppressing the Palestinian debate, the Palestinian solidarity movement and freedom of speech. It also has had a much wider impact than Palestine. It is being weaponized across Europe against Muslim communities increasingly explicitly. And as has been argued here, it's been weaponized against the left. There's been key examples given here. I just want to go back to two of them. One from Phil Butland in Germany. The heart of that resolution in the Bundestag stated this: the pattern of argument and methods of the BDS movement are anti-Semitic. What really horrified me were two things. First, the coalition behind that resolution that included the equivalent of the British Labour Party, the German Social Democrats. But second, the AfD, with its Nazi deputies at their core, baying that they were the true friends of Israel and that their BDS movement should be criminalised and banned, and that what's more, the settlers in the West Bank should be unequivocally supported. And that example you can see across Europe. When you conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, you play with fire. The far right are now holding up their hands to say, you can't call us anti-Semitic. We support Israel. And that creates tensions, by the way. It's not just quite as simple as the Zionists then being able to go into an alliance with the far right, although there are examples. And we have to see this fight, therefore, on two things. The example of the States, where there was a combative response over the question of the concentration camp comparison, actually threw the opposition back. And that's no accident, because the attack over Palestine is connected to the attack against the anti-imperialist movement and the anti-war movement generally, against the left over the question of austerity. And we have to combine an absolutely principled stand over the question of Palestine, over the offensive against those who rule us on every other front, and start to win an argument with those who are swayed and confused by the assault.
Last August, at the height of the Israeli state's bombing of Gaza, yet again the Israeli state's bombing of Gaza, a member of the NUJ executive, the only Asian member of the executive, in a height of absolute rage and anger, mistakenly retweeted a tweet condemning two Jewish Labour MPs and a Jewish Labour councillor of their support for this bombing, accusing them of having no blood in their veins. This was picked up by I think it was the Jewish news, but it was certainly one of the big Jewish newspapers, and splashed. NEC member, anti-Semitic, blah, 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 blah. Horrible, absolutely horrible. And since then, certain members of the NUJ executive, leading members, have engineered what is called a Rule 24 procedure within the union, whereby this woman has been accused of not only anti-Semitism, but bringing the union into disrepute. It is likely that she will be ordered to not only apologize, she's already apologised for doing this, she's already apologised for upsetting people and so on and so forth, but it's likely that she will be ordered to admit that what she did was anti-Semitic. Now, remember, this is a union that puts on its banner freedom of speech. It's absolutely horrific what is happening. Certainly, there is opposition to what these people are doing, and we will need to be very, very, how can I put it, strategic about how we actually defend this woman, which we have been doing, obviously, but how we actually move from this point onwards. We need to, but this is just an example in a sense. The reason why I'm here is to explain this is an example of what we are confronting right now. I don't think that this particular situation is going to be a one-off. I don't think there's any doubt that there are going to be similar moves in the trade union movement over this issue. So I think we need to be absolutely prepared to go on, wherever possible, to go on the offensive and to absolutely put the whole issue right up front, that this is not about language, it is not about alleged anti-Semitic language or whatever, it is about silencing debate over Palestine. That's what it's absolutely about, and that's obviously how we will be arguing our case over the coming period. Okay, thank you.
Right, okay. I mean, I think one of the question that many people have that doesn't quite, people don't quite understand how it is, as Ilan was saying, the sheer illogicality of the position of Western governments, that somehow, Israel seems to get a free pass, and that has led some people, of course, to start saying, posting things about, Israel's controlling the US, it's controlling the West, and so forth, which, of course, is completely the wrong way round. The reality is very, very simple. I mean, our governments like to give the impression that somehow they are bystanders. Nothing. This is something that it's happening over there, and we're very sympathetic to Jewish people, which, of course, they're certainly not. And of course, the reality is that actually Israel is all these things that are happening are because of Israel's role. And Israel's role is as the most reliable, most important guarantor of Western interest in the Middle East. And what is the most important interest of the West in the Middle East? And of course, it's oil. It's oil that is most important, probably the most important commodity in the whole of modern capitalism. And, and again, anyone who thinks that there is any chance that that governments of the West have any intention of stopping fossil fuels, you only have to look what's happening in the Middle East. It's quite clear they're going to do no such thing. And of course, the thing about Corbyn, why is that Corbyn is a threat to the most important parts of Western foreign policy, which is support for Israel. To have someone in power in Britain, which has been the long-standing supporter of Israel from the very beginning, to have him say that he's going to recognise Palestine. It is an absolute breach of Western interests, and that is one of the reasons why they are absolutely going for him, and we're getting all this nonsense. And of course the question, and there's a big question, of course, because Israel, it's not that Israel controls the West. Israel exists and survives purely because of its role in support of Western interests. And without the support of the West, it would not survive. And it's a very interesting question about what will happen when we do stop oil.
Yes, comrades. Well, when I was growing up about 100 years ago, Israel was considered a progressive state, indeed a socialist state. Idealistic young people used to spend a year in a kibbutz. Not anymore. Today, idealistic young people spend a year in a Palestinian village. Things changed around the early 80s particularly following Israel's brutal bombardment of Beirut. And I wanted just to address another point. The word apartheid is currently used quite frequently in regard to Israel, and it's quite a useful term, but it has its limitations if it's compared with South Africa. As Ilan has so eloquently described, the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed. Zionism couldn't tolerate and didn't want to employ the indigenous Palestinian population, quite the opposite of what happened in South Africa. So the Palestinians don't have economic power, as the black South African working class did. The Palestinians obviously don't have military power. They do have some ideological power, but it is up to us. Because the Palestinians depend on international solidarity, it is up to us to build a strong international solidarity movement. And my final point is about Corbyn's detractors, the Margaret Hodges of this world, and the other right-wing Labour MPs in league with the Tories and the Zionists. It is they who are the real racists, they who show not the slightest empathy with the ever-worsening plight of the Palestinians. We need to make clear they are the real racists, and we need to support Corbyn absolutely to the hilt. Thank you.
Very good evening. Ilan will say last few words.
That looks dangerous. Oops. Okay. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, great. First of all, about Germany, I think that it was very important to hear this update, but just one kind of slight warning. Germany is not going to be the first country which we are going to convince people to take bold positions on Palestine for obvious historical reasons. So we shouldn't be totally dismayed if we haven't yet won the battle in Germany. We should be much more depressed if we can't do it in this country, which is responsible for what's going on in Palestine. So I think it's important also to have a kind of perspective on this. Secondly, I think that one of the important things that we should do, we have started doing it, but not enough, definitely not in the US and the rest of the world. Our position on Palestine is not just ideological and moral. As a friend of mine used to say, when it comes to the truth, the Palestinians have nothing to lose. And what it really means is that you can teach in universities Zionism is settler colonialism. It's not just an ideological position. This is a scientific truth. You can teach what happened in 1948 as ethnic cleansing. This is not a moral position. This is exactly what happened in 1948. We should introduce into the curriculum of the universities, as we do in Exeter, the facts of life about Palestine. And in many ways, we are much more protected when we are doing this, because we are doing it as academics and scholars, but of course we should be fighting also for our right to pose these positions in the media, in the public space, and in the political space. But I think we should pressure our friends who teach in universities in this country to not to succumb to the structure of knowledge that exists by which you don't study Palestine in the history of colonialism. You don't study Palestine in the history of settler colonialism. You don't study the Nakba in the studies of genocide and human crimes. We as academics have the power to do this. It's much more difficult to stifle us than it is the public to do it to others in the public discourse. I think there's a lot to be done there. It's a long-term project. This would not bring us immediate benefits or dividends, but in the long run, we have a role as educators to make sure that this kind of language, this new dictionary, which is an old dictionary actually, would be accepted not just by our wonderful student activists on the ground, but anyone who wants to study history, political science, sociology, anthropology, feminism, doesn't matter. They need to have Palestine as a clear case study of injustice, and it's not happening yet. It's not happening yet, but it can be done, and I think it's important. To the question whether Zionism succeeds or not in equating anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, I think it depends where it succeeds. And I think we have a good analysis. They don't succeed in the civil society. They don't succeed in the Muslim world. They don't succeed in many parts of the third world and in many parts even of the West. So we have also to map correctly where the success is and get some inspiration where they fail to win the battle. And I think we should remember that this is not just in the case of Palestine. If you look at the discrepancy between the agenda of political, economic, even unfortunately academic and cultural elites in the West on issues which are important to us, and what we know our constituencies in the civil society feel about it, we know that democratically these politicians do not represent what most people would like to feel about Palestine and other issues of injustice. And finally, I really want to draw your attention to 2 points. 3 points, actually, very short. One is, I'm not crazy on politics of identity, I must say. I'd rather have politics of identification. However, I think it's time, and I'm more and more convinced, and I'm willing to be part of a new initiative that is gathering momentum. I think it's time, and maybe this would stop an end to this kind of discourse that we have about anti-Semitism. I think it's time to have a proper anti-Basel conference of all the Jews in the world who think that Israel is not a Jewish state and that Zionism betrays everything which is dear to us as Jews. Now, the Zionist Congress in Basel had 197 delegates. We aim to have 198, but in the same hotel that Herzl declared Zionism. And there is a growing movement of young Jews, secular, Orthodox, really the whole spectrum of Jewish life is beginning to warm up to the idea. And I think, although I was a bit against it to begin with, I'm beginning to be convinced it's time for a strong, universal Jewish voice by saying, not in our name. Not in our name can you oppress the Palestinians. And finally, I think we should never lose hope. The Palestinian, I came from a different conference this morning where the grandson of Nelson Mandela was speaking. And he was asked by a skeptical member of the audience, but you know, there is no Nelson Mandela among the Palestinians. And I thought about this question, and I think what is so important to understand, the Palestinian community, wherever they are the youngest community in the world. Half of the Palestinians are under 20. Among them, there are thousands of Mandelas, not one. Among them, there are men and women who are not going to give up the struggle. And we see them on a weekly basis in the Gaza March, but we see them sometimes in what Gramsci used to call cultural resistance, which doesn't attract everybody's attention, but they don't stop for one day in their struggle to defeat the idea that the Zionists had that half of the Palestinians would die and half of the Palestinians would forget. They're not going to die and they're not going to forget, and they need our help, but they will do it. I don't believe that in history evil regimes, and Zionism is an evil regime, evil regimes stay forever. So let's not lose hope and show our friends in Palestine that they have not only genuine friends here, but friends who believe that they can free Palestine from the river to the Mediterranean, and don't be just happy with liberating 15% of Palestine. We need the whole of Palestine and all the refugees to return in order that justice would come back to this land. Thank you.